Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Matt Duerden, Associate Professor of Experience Design and Management at Brigham Young University. Matt teaches experience design courses to undergraduate and MBA students, and he also works with companies to help them think innovatively about the experiences they provide to customers and employees. He is the co-author of a book called, wait for it, Designing Experiences, that had popped up on a list that I had looked up online of the best experience design books to read. And I had read it when I was interested in learning more about this topic. We've talked a little bit about it with other guests on the show, and I had wanted to immerse myself in it and learn more about it. So I had read his book. I had reached out to Matt. He was gracious enough to reply right back and say that he would love to come on and talk about it. And in this conversation, we get into all the different elements of experience design. We start at kind of the basic level and then go deeper and deeper and deeper. And, you know, it might seem like it gets a little bit more complex, but I encourage people to stick with the conversation. We talk in the beginning about how important experiences are, not only how good experiences aren't just more fun, but actually shape who we are as a person, shape our memories, shape how we think about the world, shape how we find meaning. There's really a ton of value in experience, and the world is keying into this more and more, and this experience design is becoming more and more important. So I will stop talking. We'll get right into it with Matt. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you find it useful. I hope it helps you at your company, with your family, just out in life in general, create and enjoy better experiences. Here is Matt Duerden. Matt, welcome to the show. Excited to have you here. I have really gone down this experience design rabbit hole, and your book was one of the first that I had read. And so I've got my questions. I've got even my study guide from the book here to guide us, and I'm looking forward to diving into this. I wanted to just start with your background. How does one get into experience design as a profession?
That's a great question. And first, just thanks for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be able to have this chance to chat with you. And back to your question, I mean, it's an interdisciplinary space, which is one of the reasons why I love it, right? There's a lot of, as I meet experienced designers really around the world, and people use different titles, right, in terms of describing what they do. But at the core, it's people who are interested in experiences and how to design them more intentionally. Come from all kinds of different backgrounds. You know, my origin story, I guess, really starts on a river, actually. So I grew up in a family that had a whitewater rafting outfitting company, and mainly in Idaho and California. So I started guiding when I was about 14, primarily on the main Salmon River in Idaho, and also a little bit on the Middle Fork River. These are 5 to 7 day wilderness trips.
Wow.
And even as a teenager, I would notice changes in people's behavior over a couple of days out on these rivers, right? And from a pragmatic, how do we provide a better experience to our customers perspective, I was just curious about, you know, what was it about this particular experience? Was it the setting? Was it physical challenge? Was it just being disconnected from society? But I'd see family dynamics change. I'd see people who were strangers on the bus ride in leave, you know, lifelong friends that would stay in touch and have this really powerful shared experience. Anyway, sort of fast forward down the road, a couple things happened. I thought I was going to law school, started doing some research with some professors as I wrapped up my undergraduate degree who were interested in experiences, right? I didn't know that there are people who actually studied how certain types of experiences impacted people. And it was really sort of an effort between my family's nonprofit end of our business and university that was interested in providing outdoor experiences for disadvantaged kids and also using it as a laboratory space. And conducting research on how these experiences impacted these kids. And it just suddenly I thought, oh, these are things that I've been thinking about pragmatically, as I said, but you can systematically study these, and there's theories to explain how people process experiences and how they're impacted. And that's really the through line of my career. I don't really focus on one particular type of context where experiences have occurred. I'm more interested in experiences that change people and trying to understand generalizable processes from those experiences. So I've studied outdoor experiences. I've looked at study abroad, cultural immersion. I've looked at employee experiences, learning experiences. I just bounce around to different contexts trying to understand, like, what are the ingredients to experiences that impact people in meaningful and potentially transformative ways.
That's a great backstory. And in the book, you write, people are willing to pay more for the same basic product if it's wrapped in a desirable experience. And I would just be curious, why is experience so important? I think intuitively we all want to have good experiences, but why is it such a benefit to think about an experience and plan an experience on purpose?
I think there's multiple answers to this question, and I'll highlight two that I think are important. Experiences, broadly speaking, are how we figure out who we are, right? It's as we interact with the world, right? In essence, as we interact with the world around us, that's an experience. And as we interact with the world, we get a sense of, like, this is what I like. This is what I don't like. This, when I do this thing, I feel more like myself. When I act in this way, when I have these types of experiences. So it's sort of how we craft our identity over time as we get feedback from the physical and social world around us, so to speak. I think also it's really important to note that from an experience designer perspective, I can't design experience by myself, right? It's always a co-created engagement, right? There's somebody else that is going to engage with this experience that I've designed. And ultimately, it's their perceptions of how that interaction went that is the actual product, right? Experiences are important because when I am provided a good experience by a company that I work with or an employer or whoever it might be, and I feel it's a good experience, there's this acknowledgement or recognition that somebody else saw me. Somebody else recognized that I had certain needs, and they structured the experience in a way that my needs were met, right? So there's this sense of just being seen too by somebody else. So it's both coming to understand who you are as an individual, and then also this sense of, like, oh, somebody invited me to co-create, somebody saw me and my needs and created a structure whereby those needs could be met, or an experience whereby those needs could be met.
Thank you. I definitely am with you on it is our experiences that shape who we are. Little teaser for folks out there. I actually have a children's book coming out at the end of this year, and that's what it's all about. It's called How You Become You, and it's all about encouraging people to go out and try a bunch of new things. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So
I'm a big believer in that myself as somebody who likes to try a lot of new things.
Well, good luck with the launch with that. I look forward to seeing it come out.
Thank you. This is the first I've mentioned it. So a little teaser here. Piece of housekeeping, because I want to get into the book and actually provide some tangible stuff for people to think about and use as they're building experiences. But one piece of housekeeping, what's the scope of it? When we say experience design, you can't see my air quotes, but my experience design, what's the scope of what we're talking about? Are we talking about what's the experience when somebody greets you and says hello and, welcomes you to a company, like an onboarding experience? Are we talking about the whole employee life cycle experience? Or is it small? Is it big? Is it everything? What are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll come at that from two directions. First, the way that I think about experience design and the way we talk about it in our book that Bob Rossman and I wrote, experience design is an umbrella of competencies, frameworks, content related to how you intentionally design experiences. And then there are contextual applications of those competencies, some contexts that have sort of unique aspects to them, but for the most part, there's a lot of shared competencies and approaches, whether I'm thinking about customers or whether I'm thinking about employees or whether I'm thinking about patients or whether I'm thinking about students or whether I'm thinking about primarily digital interactions or I'm thinking about a family reunion, right? Those different contexts in which experiences occur are unique, but at the same time, there are similar processes that we can use to design experiences in those spaces. And then just thinking about experiences, I sort of mentioned before, experiences occur when an individual or a group of individuals pays attention to something, right? So if I'm teaching a class and I've got a student in back, buying stuff on Amazon, they're not having the experience I designed for them. They're having their own Amazon shopping experience, right? So that attention piece is key. So having said that, as an experienced designer, we have to think about the elevation at which we're designing, so to speak. So I may zoom out at the 10,000 foot view and I'm thinking about the full employee life cycle and all the experiences that are involved with that. Or I might also, and I think good experienced designers design multiple elevations. I'm going to design in at the ground level and think about, okay, what does the experience look like for this employee on sort of a minute to minute basis, right? And where can we as an organization improve that experience, both in terms of their own job satisfaction, but also productivity of the tasks that they're assigned. And I guess the third thing that I'll say, and this is leaning on the work of Joe Pine and Jim Gilmore in the experience economy. If we think about the difference between a service and an experience, so Joe and Jim talk about this idea that a service is time well saved, right? So I've paid somebody to do something for me that I don't want to do. And an experience is time well spent, right? Like I'm paying to be able to actually engage in the experience. And then they go further and say with the transformation economy, which is, I think, emerging and become more and more relevant, it's time well invested, right? I'm investing money in myself to have experiences that potentially transform me. But going back to this idea of services and experiences, if we're thinking about the employee life cycle, for example, this full experience, every touch point doesn't need to be meaningful or transformational, right? Some of those touch points are just service touch points. They should just be easy. I think a big job of an experienced designer is just to make things easier. And then there's going to be moments that will rise above that. So a way to think about this is there's basic baseline promises or expectations when we engage with a company, right? We have an experience with a company. We expect those are just basic service quality. We expect the space to be clean or the website to be easily navigatable. We expect
somebody to pick up
to
the
be
phone.
Friendly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just those things. So when those things are met, that's just sort of like, that's a service, right? And usually it's just easy, right? We're not experiencing strong emotions or it's just, this is how it should work, right? But if we start being able to provide experiences that evoke emotion, that provide people personally relevant insights or even give them opportunities to change, that's when it moves from being a service to an experience, right? Where it's like, oh my goodness, the way this company recovered when they made a mistake and made it up to me and did all these things, like I appreciate that. Like I felt this emotion of being seen. It's suddenly gone from a service to an experience. So anyways, I sort of went down a couple of rabbit holes with your question there.
No, you answered, this is efficient interviewing because you answered two questions that I was going to ask you anyway. Because I think that distinction is important between run-of-the-mill experiences and big, profound experiences. And you and Bob lay that out really well in the book, thinking about the different levels. And I think if every experience was some mind-blowing experience, then either it would be too much or we would become numb to it. And I think to your point, like sometimes we just want to get our question answered quickly. Yeah. Like a great service experience is somebody picks up the phone within 3 rings. They know the answer to my question, help me troubleshoot whatever I'm troubleshooting, and then I can get on with my day. And like,
exactly,
it doesn't change who I am as a person, but man, is that a great experience to have versus what it could be.
Totally. And you think about it, attention is the coin of the realm, so to speak, when we think about experience design. You could really think about it, use the word or phrase attention designer. because you're just trying to create opportunities that people will freely pay attention to something or not, right? Because you may just want it seamless and there's things happening behind the scenes to get somebody from point A to point B that they don't have to pay attention to, right? And attention is a limited resource, right? So if we are providing negative, memorable experiences where people are feeling frustration and other negative emotions, by the time we get to the point where we want them to actually have this sort of peak touch point of the experience, they're not going to have the emotional reserves, right? The website was too hard to navigate. I couldn't figure out where to park. This paperwork is like unending. So you want to make it easy as possible so people have the attention reserves to then when you say, okay, this moment's going to matter. We're really going to hit home the whole purpose of why we've asked you to spend an hour a day, your career with us, that they have the attention to pay attention.
Yeah. So let's start to dive into this. I'm somebody who is responsible for creating an experience of some kind, but we've just kind of always done it the way we've done it. We've done it intuitively versus actually sat down and mapped something out. But I want to be more proactive. I'm listening and I'm listening to you preach the gospel, and I want to be a member of that congregation. Sorry for butchering that analogy. Where does somebody start with this? What's the basic sort of first steps that somebody can take to start to do this more proactively?
So I would say the first sort of foundational step is having genuine curiosity about the people you're trying to design the experience for. Like, you sincerely have to be interested in what people think about whatever the particular experience is. This can't just be like, oh, this is the flavor of the month. We're just going to do this thing and maybe we'll have like twice as much food as we usually do at this onboarding or whatever it is, right? There has to be this, yes, I'm sincerely curious. I think good experienced designers are curious about people, right? Sincerely curious. Because as I mentioned before, experiences are co-created. And if we don't understand what people's needs are and really try to design towards those to meet those needs, then it doesn't really matter. We may think it's a great experience, but it's up to the people who are participating. So I think doing the work of actually, and however, there's all kinds of ways to gather data and understand audiences. I do think from an experience design perspective, you've got to have both quantitative and qualitative data. You've got to talk to people, right? And try to understand if it's a pre-existing experience, what are the peaks and pits? Like what is it that you really need out of this experience? And once you have a sense of, I've got a sense of like, these are actually the three primary needs. And we were aware of one and not the other two, right? So there's got to be this, like, I'm willing to engage in this need finding. Then in terms of starting the actual design process, I think it's really, really helpful to be able to articulate what it is you want people to say when the experience meets that need that you've identified. Because that gives you this very specific target beyond just saying that I was happy or my need was met, but really specific. Like, I'm so grateful that the company understood that I have a wife who's going through cancer treatment and I've got this thing going on and I need this process to be easier, or whatever it might be, right? And you can't, of course, do that for 1,000 employees, but to get a sense of like, these are some prominent sort of themes. And we hope that after this training or this onboarding or this career transition, people would say this thing. And so once you know what the end point is, then you can go back and say, okay, what do we need to do? How do we prepare people? And I talk about this as the anticipation phase of the experience. Like, what do we need people to do or think or understand before the experience begins? And once the experience is done, like, what else needs to happen to help them curate the memories of the experience, so to speak? So we start like breaking it down into these touch points, right? And it may just be at first we're like, we've got 2 or 3 touch points before the experience happens, and we've got 2 to 3 during and then afterwards. But at least starting to say, here's our end point, and then just breaking this down into steps. It goes back to these elevations, right? Of stepping back and saying, okay, here's the full journey we want people to go on to get to this point where they say this thing, right? And then starting to zoom in and thinking about those individual touch points along the way.
I like that you pointed out the two different things that people should think about. One, get the feedback, and then two, think about what do we want them to say or feel at the end of the experience? Because I think you highlighted that those overlap, but I think they also can be different. And it is important to talk about the two, because when you were saying, what are the two or three things that people want out of this experience? There's also an element as a designer, I would imagine, that we want to give them something new or novel. We want them to come away with something that they weren't prepared for. And if you're just giving people what they need, that can be kind of boring sometimes. And so I like thinking, well, what do we want them to have? And for a long time, I was involved with a nonprofit here in Chicago called Embark, and we throw Variety Spectacular, sort of anti-gala. And we always said, we want to raise money. We want people to feel connected to the organization, but we also want people to walk away going, man, I've never been to anything like that before. And to have at least one or two stories that they could go back and tell somebody else, I saw this last night, or I got to do this last night. That would be different than anything they could do anywhere else. And I think that building that novelty in, finding one or two ways to create that kind of novelty can often have a huge impact. I've seen it have a big impact.
Totally. I think that's such a great point. And it goes back to this idea that experiences are co-created, right? You're just not just meeting the people's needs. You're also thinking like, at the end of a good experience, the provider and the participant should both say, that was time well spent, right? I don't know if have you read the book Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath?
I was going to bring that up later. Yes.
Okay. So that's a great book, right? And so they talk about designing for signature moments. And one of those signature moments is, I think it's moments of insight. I have to go back and look, but they have this idea of, designing experiences to help people trip over the truth, where it's like, oh, I thought the world was one way, and I had this experience and realized, oh, it's a different way. People aren't coming into the experience saying like, I want my mindset changed. As a provider, for whatever reason, you're saying like, no, actually, you need to have your mindset changed. Like the people in supply chain at the company aren't trying to undermine you, right? Like let's create an opportunity so you can see that you're both sort of working on the same team or whatever it might be. So I think, that's a great point you bring up.
Okay. There's a bunch of ways we can go here, but let's start at the beginning of the event, because you teased a few things that I want to get into. The first is the start of the experience. And I think a lot of people think of the start of the experience as when people show up to do whatever the thing is that they're going to do. But you talk about the anticipation phase of the experience. Can you explain what that is and why that's important and how people can think about designing that phase?
Yeah, so I lean a lot on narrative structure when I think about designing experiences, because we've figured out across time and cultures how to tell stories. Different models, and there's nuanced differences between sort of Western and Eastern traditions. But in general, you have this idea of whether it's a 5-stage story or the narrative pyramid, there's this idea of there's like the setting the stage. Then there's a transition into the actual sort of, there's usually an inciting incident or a crossing the threshold moment, right? This is Bilbo deciding, is he going to go leave the Shire, for example? And then there's rising action and there's tension and there's some type of climax moment and then a resolution. And so if we think about that from the perspective of an experience design, we need to understand like where people are before they're coming into our experience, right? It's the setting the stage, understanding our characters, and then recognizing that we want them, once they cross the threshold into the experience that we've designed for them, we want them to be ready to roll, right? We don't want to take a ton of time to be like, okay, where do I go? And how do I do this? And what do I do? So there's just sort of functional things that we need to think about, right? Again, as I said, if people show up and they can't figure out how to park or can't log in or don't know the Zoom link or whatever the experience is, like that's just burning attention unnecessarily, right? So I have to think just logistically, like where do we need them to be physically or digitally and make that as easy as possible. But then we also want to think about like where do we want them to be from an attitude or emotion standpoint, right? Like what's the emotional state we want them to be in? Do we want them to be excited and amped up? Do we want them to be peaceful? Do we want them to be introspective? And so thinking about like, how do we help people cross that threshold into our experience, both logistically and emotionally, is, I think, like simple, but also really nuanced and can be really powerful, because once somebody's committed to spend a certain amount of time with them, I think you want to honor that time and make it as meaningful as possible. I think great stories usually have a very clear crossing the threshold moment where the world that was suddenly is different, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about how do you make that crossing the threshold moment not only easy and intentional, but also memorable. You talked about like novelty, right? Then you start diving into the sort of the touch point design of thinking, yeah, what are the sights, sounds, smells? What are the things that clearly signal to somebody, okay, this experience has started and it's different than your everyday world that you were just in. So that's sort of the work you want the anticipation phase to do, so that when you start that actual experience, people, like I said, are logistically and emotionally where you want them to be.
What are some thoughts that you have around good threshold moments? What are some of those things that signal to people that they've stepped into a different world than their normal reality, or that start to really create the experience that you want to create? Are there any rules or principles that you've seen work well?
Yeah. So I think, in our book, we talk about the 6 elements of the experience scape, right? So if you think about it, if you're a landscaper, right, you have certain tools, plants and hardscaping and water features, right? These are sort of the tools of the landscape. And designing experiences, it's a little bit more abstract, but there's still specific tools we use, right? So we talk about a variety of things, but one of those is the place, right? So we can start there. What are just like the sensory elements? As I mentioned before, sights, sounds, smells, touch, like what, as people first interact with the space, whether this is a website or a physical space, like what's happening in that space that is different from where they came from, right? And not that you just want to like sensory overload them, or maybe it is what you want to do. You're entering a concert venue or some, exhibition booth, and you are just trying to wow people. But you want to think about, Joe Pine and Jim Gilmore talk about this idea of harmonizing cues. So Walt Disney said, everything in an experience speaks, right? And you want everything to be speaking in harmony with each other. So you have to think about like, what's the overall vibe, theme of this experience? And then really lean into that. I think sometimes theme can be seen like that's what you do for like an 8-year-old's birthday party. It's a pirate theme. But I really think any organization should have a really clear theme. Just how you have a brand guide, you should have an experience guide to say, yeah, when we provide experiences, these are sort of the things that are always going to be present. So people know like, oh, this is a company X experience, right?
Yeah.
And
what a great way, just to interrupt there. Like, I love that, because I mean, a lot of listeners to this are people leaders in companies. One of the big issues that I see a lot is ways to permeate the culture across the whole company, right? To make the culture and the values that you put on the wall actually executable day to day. I think what you just said is a really good insight to that when you're actually thinking about all of the experiences, whether it's a town hall, whether it's an onboarding, whether it's benefits enrollment, whether it's how you offboard people. If you can define what the values are or what the experience elements are of working at your company, and then just real quick for all of those things, just do a quick reference check and say, hey, how are we delivering on teamwork here? How are we delivering on honesty here? How are we delivering? Okay, have we got all that? All right, good. Then it's an XYZ company experience. We can go roll with it.
Totally. Yeah. Because I mean, almost all organizations of some degree of maturity are going to have a brand guide, right? That they're going to be like, oh yeah, we all like you use this logo only in these contexts and don't stray out of this colorway. And right, that's just accepted best practice. But very, very few companies do that with experiences. And it starts exactly with what you're saying. Let's review our institutional sort of identity documents. Like, what are they saying? What do we know that our employees, if we're thinking about employee experiences, Like, what are the reasons why employees like to work here? Like, what are the values that are important to them, right? And then from that, whether that's taking a tagline from an existing mission or culture statement or creating, your own sort of like brand theme, experience theme statement or something. And just always, does it connect back to this, right? Does it connect back to this? And I'll go back to Disney, right? He was just really, really intentional with experience design elements to the point where he said, hey, people interact with the park, if we're thinking about Walt Disney World or Walt Disneyland, first with their feet, right? And if we've got these very thematic areas, like the pavement should be different in Tomorrowland than Adventureland, right? Because that's a harmonizing cue, right? And the garbage cans in these different spaces, they're all serving the same function of trash receptacles, but they should thematically say you're in Adventureland. And so whether it's a town hall or whether it's onboarding, it should say, hey, you're in an event provided by this company and you should just feel that viscerally. So then you just start, if we think about like rules is another one of those elements. Like, what are the rules of the space, right? Well, it's maybe a rule if it's teamwork and we're all on the same team, maybe there's always name tags because it's a big company and you want to be able to have leaders always address people by their first names and rather just expecting everybody remembers it. It's like, no, we're just always going to have name tags or whatever it might be. It's like, we're going to create a structure where we're going to try to really honor those values through the experiences we provide.
I love that. So would you mind listing the 6 experience-scape elements? I know you've hit on a few of them, but it'd just be good to have all of them together.
Yeah. So it starts with 2 that are connected to people. First is people, right? Who are the people that are coming to, going to be participating, but also providing, right? And what do you know about them? Sometimes it's even people that aren't participating, but are influencing those who aren't. So what are people saying on social media? It's just all of the people parts. The second one is relationships. What do you know about the relationships between these people? Do you have people coming to the experience that already know each other? Or maybe they don't know each other, but you need them to know each other. Or you don't, right? It would be weird to go to a movie and everybody stand up and be like, hi, I'm Matt. I'm really excited for this movie. My favorite characters, right? So, or I don't know, that could be like a new movie experience, right?
Yeah.
So then we talked about place. This is both the physical or digital place. It could also be the place and time, right? If you take an experience and move it from the winter to the summer or the morning to the evening, that changes the nature of the experience. And I guess I'll back up and say, you tweak any of these. If you want to change an experience, you often don't have to wholesale change it. You just change an element of the experience. And then we've got rules that I've mentioned already. All experiences have rules. They basically just sort of constrain and create the playing field. Games, basketball is just a set of rules, right? That's the core of what sort of basketball is. But there's social rules and norms, but there might be institutional or even, legal rules. You run, anybody who's worked for an international company realizes there's different rules that govern how you do business in different places, and those impact the experience as well. Then there's the objects. Those could be the physical objects in the experience, but also symbolic objects like a company's logo, or I often use the example of like sports team logos. Like those evoke different emotions for different people, right? I just spent the first half of the year teaching in London, and depending on which football team, we're thinking, European football, soccer here, you see somebody walking down the street, that can lead to all kinds of different interactions, right? Based upon your allegiance, but it's just a symbolic logo, right? And then the last one is probably the least thought of and maybe the least flashy, but it's just this idea of blocking, which is a theater analogy of how you move people and things through space. But we've all had experiences where we're standing in this line and we have no idea why we're there and how long it's going to take, and can be like one of the worst experiences. And there's people who study cueing, like cueing science and just how you move people through experiences more quickly. A lot of the things that happened during COVID is companies try to figure out how to make people feel physically and emotionally safe in spaces like you can come back to our restaurant or our business. They were I'm pulling a lot from Joe Pine today, but he talked about this as like safety theater. There's like 6 feet apart, and there's hand sanitizer and this and that. And some of it was like, yeah, this will keep you safe. And others we're just trying to like signal that this is a COVID-free space type of thing. But blocking is super important, right? We think about the signage and how we move people around. And there's so many big events where the last touch point is being stuck in a parking lot, right? And we tend to remember what happens at the end of the experience. That just sort of sticks in our memory. And so if you've had this great experience and then you can't figure out how to leave, that really can color how you feel about the whole experience. So people, relationships, place, rules, objects, blocking are those 6 elements.
I love that. Thank you for running through all of those. And I was going to ask you to go deeper on blocking, and I think you hit that really nicely. You're just doing my job for me here today.
No worries.
I guess I'll just ask, is there anything that you would add on blocking besides what you just said? Because I think it's something that makes sense when you think about it, but I don't know that people think about it a lot. They think about, oh, well, we go here and then we go there and then we do this thing. And they think of maybe order over time, but that's a little different from blocking, I think.
No, I mean, I think it's a really relevant point. And this is why I'm a big fan of experience maps, of just identifying, okay, what are the touch points? And then visualizing, especially if you're working with a team, to just sit down and say, almost, again, I'm going back to Disney too, right? Disney created this process of storyboarding when he was pitching Snow White. No one had ever done a feature-length animated film, right? It just seemed weird and investors were not super interested. But he said, well, let's have the animators just sketch up these different pictures that tell the story. And then when I go out and pitch it to people, I can walk them through the story. And then when we're working as a creative team, we can move these things around. And, now storyboarding is used everywhere.
I did not realize that he was the one who created storyboarding.
Yeah. I mean,
that's fascinating.
Super interesting, because it's just this widely accepted tool. And basically experience maps are storyboards, right? So once you've got your experience map built out, you can then walk through with your team, basically visualizing what will this experience look like from the participant's perspective, and to get a sense of time, for example, how you thought, right? Because if you're like, oh yeah, we're going to start the meeting, we're going to start the town hall at 9, we've told people to show up at 8:15, and then you're actually running it and be like, oh, there's no way we can get everybody through this one door into these seats and get them their registration packets or whatever it might be, right? So it's thinking about, what is that flow? This is very much almost like a supply chain problem. Where are our bottlenecks? How do we move people and make it easy? And I think for me, as someone who pays a lot of attention to experiences, blocking, when it's well done, is something that just delights me, because I look for it and be like, oh my goodness, that was so easy. Like that was excellent. And then when it's poorly, it just is stress inducing, right? To just be like, what do I do? Like, why is this taking so long? Frustrations. I think about different airport experiences we've had in other places.
Yeah. Anytime you're waiting or something's frustrating, that's a blocking problem.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Somebody didn't think this through as well as it could have been. And it, there's this classic example of an airport trying to, I think it was George Bush International, trying to figure out how to deal with all the complaints that they were getting about the wait to get bags. And there's this whole process of like, we need faster conveyor belts, and we need to redo this system and make the TV screen so people can like watch stuff while they're waiting. And ultimately the decision that was made was, let's just reroute planes and make it so that people on average are dropped off farther away from the baggage claim. So we'll double the walking time, which means the bags will be there when they get there. And the complaints went way down, right? They didn't have to build any new infrastructure. It's about perceived wait time and not actual wait time. And so if you're doing something, if you're just walking further and then you get there and your bags are there, it's like, oh, great. So they solved it with blocking.
Yeah. It's funny. I do that myself because it's much better to go to the bathroom and like waste a little bit of time before you get your bags and have the bags be ready when you're there than to do all that stuff after. So like if the kids need something, do it right when you get off the plane. And then by the time you get to the bags are ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
That's funny. Want to talk also about relationships a little bit more, because I think this is an important one. Would love to hear your take on what are the best ways to bring people together in a group at the beginning of an experience? Because you mentioned, not every experience you have to. You go to the movies, right. I love. That's a great example of a lot of people doing something together and you never have to meet or even look at somebody else in the room. Totally fine. But there are a lot of experiences where forming those relationships is really important. So are there any best practices at the beginning of an event to forming those types of relationships?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really great point and something that I think deserves thinking intentionally about. So a couple of things that I'll say. One, I think this is an anticipation phase task, or it can be. Thinking about if we want people to know each other, or at least know each other a little bit better before they come, like what can we do beforehand to facilitate that process? And I actually think there's some hybrid options. If we're thinking about an in-person event, we can leverage everybody's comfort, like high comfort levels with hybrid solutions and online conferencing and things. So I've seen this happen in a couple of places. In fact, we hosted a conference, an experience research conference at my university last fall. And one of the things that we did is we just had a pre-conference virtual kickoff where we just invited attendees to come together online in Zoom. We gave them some just sort of logistical information, but then we spent a bunch of time in like a couple of rounds of just breakout rooms where you just randomized people, stuck them in rooms, gave them a couple of questions to talk about and said, okay, you've got 7 minutes. Then we rotated through. With our goal being, if when you got to the conference, there was at least, 4 or 5 people who you already knew that you could be like, oh, hey, Susan, we talked in that breakout room, right? And it just made that barrier of networking a little bit easier. So I think that's something that you can do that type of thing beforehand. Yeah. I already mentioned like name tags or other things, like how do you just make it easier to connect with people? And then finally, something that I've actually been thinking about a lot in some of my research right now is one way there's all kinds of different ways to measure sort of social connection or how well comfortable people feel with each other. I think one interesting sort of angle on this is how curious are people about each other? I believe that the more curious a group of people is about each other, the more tightly connected they are. One way to do this, there's all kinds of like ice-breaking games and improv stuff, and some of those things can like work really well. But I think also just creating spaces for people to bring their whole selves into whatever the context is. If this is work, sort of bring your whole selves to work. As you learn about somebody a little bit more holistically, I think it tends to help you, one, be more curious and interested. And the more curious you are about somebody, I think that also increases empathy levels. There's actually research around this idea of motivational empathy, that there's one thing to be like, oh, wow, that's really hard that thing happened to you. And I felt sad before and I can see you feel sad. But there's also research to show that the more you start to get to know someone, the more intrinsically motivated you are to help that person. I think there's some interesting ways to give people space to talk about things that are important to them, even if it may not be work related. Just so that somebody understands like, oh yeah, Tim and John like mountain bike on the weekends. Like that's really interesting. I had no idea that they don't look like they're mountain bikers, but yet they get out and do this thing. I'm that much more curious about that person. So how do you build in opportunities for people to become curious about each other is one way to think about the relationship piece. Yeah,
I love that. I'll just share one anecdote and shout out to one of my good friends, Wes, who was my best man for my wedding, and he planned my bachelor party. Everybody came out of that thing being like, I don't know how we did as much as we did and had as much fun as we had in that short a period of time. And he was very specific about how he designed that weekend. And it started with everybody came in from different parts of the country and just met at a restaurant, and we had a very casual lunch. And then we went and immediately did an escape room together. The two back to back allowed for just the very casual mingling, no pressure, getting to know each other a little bit. And then we were thrust into a situation where it didn't matter. Like, you couldn't feel awkward because you didn't know somebody. You had a time constraint and you had to solve a problem together. And by the time we walked out of that event, in this case, we were in Austin, Texas. We'd been in Austin for like 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. And everybody was hugging each other. Everybody was laughing. We were walking to to go get the car to go where we were going to stay. I just noticed that a bunch of the groups had like intermixed already, like right off the bat already had intermixed. We're joking about what had just happened. And I was like, wow, what an incredible way to get everybody immediately on the same page and build those relationships really quickly. So I was reading your book. I just was thinking about all the different experiences I've had in my life where you're like, wow, that was so much fun, or that was so great. And it was amazing how in such a short time you could bring a group of 15 people together so quickly.
Yeah, I love that. I love the sequencing there, right? There was this, but the fact that you had this opportunity to sort of casually interact and like, oh yeah, I met a couple of people, and then thrust into this. And you think that's one of the main jobs that I think experiences can do, is provide shared opportunities to connect. Because really, when we get together with people that we care about, we talk about experiences that we've had together, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about, like there's the experience of like sitting in a town hall and just having conversations, which is way different than like even just adding in small breakout groups beforehand and maybe afterwards, so that there's some type of interaction that occurs where you walk away and be like, I didn't just sit in this town hall, but I also had a conversation that was pretty interesting with these 3 people from other divisions of how they thought about this thing. And it may not be to the level of an escape room. And those can, those types of like experiences that are very novel and involve some type of challenge and time constraints, like those can be powerful too. But again, like how do you build in a little bit of shared experience early on can be super powerful. I like when I'm teaching, I usually don't start a class by just jumping in and lecturing, right? It's usually always like small group stuff, because I'm like, I want you to just connect and talk with people where you feel like, oh yeah, these 4 people saw me and I'm not just this faceless person in a classroom.
Well, and that, to your earlier point, that starts to focus your attention, right? It pulls the attention into the room or into the space. And then you can keep it there versus just standing there and lecturing and hoping that attention starts to gravitate to you. You do something, you can force localized attention right off the bat and then use that to get to whatever you need to get to afterwards.
And going back to your bachelor party example, because of that escape room experience, people aren't thinking like, I don't know half the people here. This is sort of awkward. I only know like, the guy who's getting married, right? Like, that doesn't take up brain space anymore, which allows them to just pay attention to the experience more.
Yeah. Cause like, you're just like running around being like, wait, I got this. Wait, what do you got? And like, you're forced to take that ego part off and just be.
Totally.
Yeah. Shout out, Wes. Let's flip all the way to the end then, because we talked about anticipation and that threshold. But at the end, I know you said already on here about the reflection phase. Can you talk to that? You mentioned endings are important, but there's even a part after endings that are important in the reflection phase. What is that? How should people think about that?
So I think it's really, really important to recognize that an experienced designer, I think you have an obligation to help people transition their memories of an experience back into the real world, right? We've been using a couple of plane flying analogies already, but it's akin to, if you've ever had the experience of either traveling between state lines where they check if you have, fruit that you can't bring into California and they take your grapefruit, or you're traveling international, like, oh, you can't take this chocolate in there. I think that happens sometimes with experiences too, that you have this, let's say you have a really, what in the moment feels like this really meaningful experience, maybe even transformative. And then you go back home and get caught up in just the rush of everyday life. And that just fades really quickly into the background, right? It's like you weren't allowed to bring those memories home with you. And so I was thinking about a way as a provider to do that, both in terms of how experiences end. I think ending on high notes and all of those things. I mean, that's a topic too, but just thinking about that transition, like how do we help people bring their memories home with them and continue to curate those memories? Some of the research I'm doing right now is looking at is there a difference between when people have a shared experience and then are able to get together in person and talk about that experience versus doing it virtually, say like on some Facebook chat group, or just individually reflecting on it, like journaling versus no reflection at all. Like how did those influence the experience? And so I think it's thinking about like, yeah, what are ways that we can continue to nudge or remind people or make it easy for memories to come up. But often the only thing that you get after an experience is a survey. And if it's a really long, cumbersome survey, it's like, oh, this is a pain, right? Yeah. And then that becomes the last memory. I use this journaling app called Day One.
Okay.
And just drop in some pictures and do some journaling. And one of the features that it does on my phone is it will pop up all of the entries I've had on June 9th, for example. And it'll be like, this happened 4 years ago and this happened 8 years ago. And I love that because it just brings these memories. I'm like, oh yeah, that's when we were doing this. And I remember this thing that was happening. And it's just this automated reflection that brings these memories back viscerally that I otherwise wouldn't think about. And so I think to think about, yeah, we need to collect data and understand how the experience went, but what else can we do to either help people, make it easy for them to sort of connect and reflect, or other things that sort of nudge people along? I mean, one of the most common ways that companies will do this is some type of memorabilia, right? There's some type of memorabilia, but I think there's ways to think about hybrid solutions, whether it's like if it's a learning experience, what are ways that we sort of provide opportunities down the road to be like, hey, remember this thing? Or here's a couple of, have you applied this yet or done that type of thing? So I think endings are important, but I really think of all the phases, the reflection phase is usually the least paid attention to. But in terms of facilitating long-term change, it's the most important phase.
Well, and I love the imagery of the upfront, the transition from the anticipation to the beginning of the event being a threshold that people cross where something happens and they go, oh, I'm in a different world. And I love carrying that, to your point about stories. I love carrying that all the way through to the end. They have to step back across the threshold, back into the real world. But, oh, look, they get to bring this thing with them. And how do we help them bring that thing with them into the real world? I love that visual.
Yeah. And I think you're totally right, because in most stories, the recognition of transformation doesn't happen until they get back home. And they're like, oh, wow, I'm changed, right? Now that I'm back in this setting. And that can go one of two ways, right? It can be like, oh, this is sort of actually, I feel like I don't fit, or like it doesn't really I don't know how to be the person I was then now. Or it can be like, wow, I have the ability to sort of make an impact and be different in this context and make the space around me better, so to speak. I brought up Bilbo Baggins already. When the hobbits go back to the Shire, they're physically taller, right? Because they'd had their adventures and drank something along the way, right? But there's a physical transformation that happens as well. So I'm glad that you bring up that back end point of narrative structure.
Yeah. And this might be a little weird and nerdy, but if you like storytelling, there's a really good book on storytelling called The Land of the Dead. And it's actually a graphic novel. So it's really cool and kind of creepy illustrations, but it tells storytelling arcs. And so it talks about how every story has a land of the dead where the rules are different, things change, things are a little riskier. But then when you go through and you come out the other side, you sort of bring something back with you. It just made me think of that. It's a great book and really easy to read. And because it's instructional, but in a story format, it's really easy to absorb.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad you bring that up. I actually teach a class for our honors program at the university here at BYU called The Art of Transformative Storytelling. Oh. So I'm always looking for storytelling. The class, our basic hypothesis is that people who have better storytelling skills are more likely to be able to recognize change they've experienced and articulate that to others. Basically, like storytelling is key for personal transformation.
Yeah.
And so I'm always looking for good books that teach about storytelling. So I'll add that. The one that we're currently using in the class is called How to Tell a Story by The Moth. I don't know if you've ever listened to The Moth podcast.
I have not, but I know of it and I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so it's a great book, How to Tell a Story. But I'm going to check out Land of the Dead. I just made a note about that, so thanks.
Yeah, and the author of that, a guy named Brian McDonald, is a co-host of a podcast called You Are a Storyteller. And he's a screenwriter, cool, comic book writer, graphic novelist, author, but has taught at Pixar and other places. And there are a couple really good episodes in there on story structure that I found to be pretty enlightening.
Oh, awesome. Thanks. That's a great tip.
On the side, I enjoy fiction writing. As I mentioned, I wrote a children's book, but I've written a couple novels for fun too. And so
oh, that's awesome.
I got the storytelling bug. I shot a couple short films in college. So I find storytelling to be sort of a passion interest of mine.
Yeah, I think there's so much value in taking storytelling elements and using them in different places. It's just how stories are how we make sense of the world around us and our place in it. And I think everybody should hone their storytelling skills. It's just such a broadly applicable competency.
Yeah. Well, and I love what you're talking about, taking storytelling and making it actually immersive so that people feel the story as they're going through it.
Yeah, totally.
So a couple just final questions as we wrap up here. First of all, just to kind of summarize what we've been talking about, because I think it can be hard for people to hear all of this and not go, oh my God, this is too much. I don't have time to get to any of this. I think if I were to offer some suggestion here, there's like 101, 201, 301, right? There's like levels to this. And if nothing else, I think if people just thought and asked, what do people want from this experience? And what do we want people to come away from this experience with? If you just ask those two questions and get specific on that, I think you'll naturally make better experiences. Totally. And then from there, I think the 201, and you can correct any of this, but I think the 201 is the 6 elements of the experience scape that you outlined, and just thinking through, okay, now that we know what people want, we know what we want them to feel. Let's just pay attention. Like, let's just run through a quick checklist. Have we planned for each of these things? And then I think the 301 would be, all right, let's actually map this out and be really specific on paper about the touch points and how we build this thing out before we go execute it. And, maybe we even pilot it so that we understand the blocking and the flow of this.
Yeah.
Does that feel right? Okay. I love that. I mean, I start the experience design class that I teach for undergraduates and MBAs. We start with just this experience analysis framework where I say, just go out, like, have experiences. I don't care if this is like a meeting or you're going out to dinner with friends, but just go and just be a little bit more observant and have them report back on those 6 elements. And just say, like, which ones contributed, which ones detracted, and which ones were neutral in the experience. And just getting in that mindset, because you just start paying attention. And I warn people too, I say, this is going to ruin you because you're always going to be thinking about this. And you're going to be the person, at dinner and be like, well, that like ordering system was not very effective or whatever. But yeah, just that sense of just being aware, you'll just naturally start seeing things like, oh, usually it's not wholesale, like changing a whole experience. It's just starting to like tweak some things. And I think the only other thing that I'll add is I think it's also a good starting point to just pick an experience. This could be in your personal or professional life, and just say, okay, what are the touch points of this experience? Like, what is my morning routine? Or how do I do this process at work? And just sort of writing it out. And if it's an experience that you yourself engage in, just thinking like, yeah, what are sort of what's working and what's not working in this experience? What are the peaks and the pits? Or if it's one that you provide the same, talk to some of your employees and say, like, is this what this looks like for you? And like, what works and what doesn't work? Because I think we just get in habit. We just go in autopilot. And oftentimes there's things that we can just tweak and say, you know what, if I didn't check my email first thing in the morning and waited an hour,
I would be much more emotionally resilient for the rest of the day. Just making that one little change, just moving that touch point down an hour later, for example.
Yeah. I love that. I have two more questions as we wrap up here. The first one is, when things go wrong, because inevitably things go wrong, what words of wisdom or comforts can you provide to people for when they've really done this work and they've planned out an experience and things go wrong?
So I think first, hopefully you think about just some contingency plans. Like if you're aware of okay, here's some things that could happen, right? We're doing this outdoors. Do we have a backup plan if it rains? Or, we're running this virtual event on this platform. Do we know how to get hold of everyone? Do we have the email addresses all in one place if for some reason we're having technical difficulties? So just trying to have sort of contingency plans, I think, can be really helpful. Things happen. And I think there's a couple of ways to think about this. One, if you remember what it is that you want people to say at the end of the experience, you can be a little bit more surgical and saying, okay, this thing happened. What do we need to do to reach this sort of end outcome that we're hoping for? And, the research is pretty clear that customers are usually more loyal to a brand that's failed and recovered than one that hasn't ever failed before.
Good
right?
point.
And so just because you fail, it doesn't matter. This is when your frontline people, if we're thinking about customer interactions, know that ultimately what you want people to say is this at the end of the experience, it gives them a little bit more elbow room to innovate and think okay, what can I do in the moment that will help? So I think that's one thing. And the last thing that I'll say is, I think also just being honest with people, right? And just saying hey, this unexpected thing happened. This is what we're going to try to do to fix it. We're sorry. Of course, there's situations where you can just handle something quickly in the backstage and people aren't going to realize. I think people also just appreciate honesty and transparency in those situations. Then you just do your best. Again, if I feel like I'm seen when something goes awry, I'm way less likely to get frustrated than if nothing's ever why is this a problem? Why is this? I don't know why I'm still waiting in line or whatever. I think just being transparent can be helpful.
Yeah. And I like that point about when things go wrong, you can actually build loyalty by fixing them with customers. Just thinking through that, it almost it creates an opportunity, right? Okay, you've screwed something up, something's wrong, but now there's an opportunity to show your perseverance, to show your work ethic, to show your loyalty, to show, whatever, to make that thing right or to solve that problem or to create a good experience for people in the long run. And so that's what people remember, I think, is, oh man, yeah, remember when that thing went wrong and then you came out and you made it right? That was great the way you did that. I just think people remember that. I think back when I got married, we'll keep that story going from the bachelor party to the wedding. When I got married, we were in a beautiful venue. We were outside. It was everything was lining up to be perfect. And we had this kind of cute ceremony where we were going to open this box and the vows were going to be in there and we were going to read our vows to each other and open the box and the vows aren't there. And we had given them to our wedding planner and said, hey, these need to go in the box. And she had put them in the garbage box, not in the wedding box.
Oh no.
And so there were no vows and the wedding planner was inside. She wasn't even outside with us. And so my brother just hightailed it inside to try to find her. And I was the only one mic'd. And so I started telling jokes to the crowd and it wound up being this kind of funny moment. And then my brother, 5 minutes later, comes the door crashes open and my brother comes running out and he holds them up in his hand and he's got the two books with the vows in it and everybody cheered. And we made another joke about it. We were getting married on Friday the 13th. So that was kind of the joke we were making.
Yeah.
And then, we wound up reading the vows and it went on. And that moment is a moment that people still bring up today. And totally. I've got a great photo of the front of this beautiful house and my brother with the vows in the air. The photographer captured that moment. It's one of my favorite pictures of the whole wedding. My wife and I aren't even in it. And like those things become seminal moments. And so I think
totally
in the moment, it feels like, oh shit, this is going to be horrible. Yes. If you can catch that and do what needs to be done, they often become foundational moments.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I love that point. I think, going back to, my background as a river guide, the trips that people remembered and talk about are where we flipped boats or weather was crazy or this thing happened. Oftentimes it opens up space for other people to get involved, like your brother, and be part of the solution. And that just becomes so much more memorable, right? The other thing it makes me think of, one of my other favorite recent books is Adam Grant's most recent book, Think Again, where he basically talks about just the power of being willing to think again, to recognize that we're wrong, and then to learn from that, and to sort of reframe how we think about failure. And I mean, this is also sort of a design thinking, human-centered design principle of fail fast or, lean processes. But if you can also just have this attitude that everything's a prototype, we're going to learn often the most from the things that don't go wrong. I think just trying to inculcate that type of attitude in a team can be really, really powerful, because it opens people up to be a little bit more willing to try new things, to test out stuff, and not have this sense of like, it's got to be perfect from the beginning, because nothing is. And also, if it was, it's like pretty boring. I think it actually means that you're playing it too safe if everything always runs perfectly, right? There's got to be some room to just sort of like, this is a prototype. I tell this at the beginning of my career when I was teaching, I was so nervous about every single lesson and everything going wrong. And when I got student evaluations at the end of the semester, it was just like, okay, I'm going to read through these. What are they going to be like? But now, I talk about this idea that everything's a prototype from the beginning. I'm like, this class is a prototype. We have open discussions in class at different periods of the semester. Just say like, okay, what works? What doesn't work? Like, how do we, as a community, sort of make this thing better that we're doing? The trajectory of improvement is much steeper than if I'm just trying to make everything perfect on my own.
Yeah, I love that. And we are at the end of time. My last question is, how can people turn this off and step back over the threshold and take some of this into their lives? What suggestions do you have for people to start to actually integrate this stuff into their daily life?
Pick a mini project. Think about an hour of your day that you could just map out, and like your morning routine or something, or just try a little project. I think a little win of having an experience of just tweaking an experience to make it more intentional allows you the confidence to then say, oh, okay, let's try this out. And you'll just start seeing experiences in your personal and professional lives that could be more intentional. And that momentum will just grow to the point you're like, okay, I'm going to bring other people on board. We're going to think about sort of bigger projects at work. But rather than like, we've got to like do all this stuff that we've talked about over the last hour or so, but just to say, just pick a mini project and think if you can just tweak it and make it an experience a little bit more intentional.
I love that. And I would encourage people to do that both at work and at home. I think this stuff applies to your next family vacation, to your trip to the zoo, to a family dinner, all that stuff, just as much as it does to your employee communications and what you're doing with your workforce. So Matt, thank you for writing the book. I would encourage everyone to go out and buy it. It is fantastic, and it's a great reference guide. I encourage you to buy it in hard copy because it is one that you'll want to go back to if you are designing experiences. Matt, just really appreciate you making time today for the show.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for being such a great host, and the conversation's been awesome. I've really enjoyed it.
All right. Good luck out there, everybody.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.